I was a good soldier once. I believed in the Emperor's light, in duty, in the promise that service meant something more than mere survival. I held that belief through 17 campaigns across worlds whose names I can no longer pronounce, through the mud and the blood and the screaming. I held it even as I watched better men than me die for inches of scorched earth. I held it right up until the moment they handed me that data slate. It was a Tuesday, I think, though time loses meaning when you've been garrisoned in the bowels of a troop carrier for 3 months, waiting for your next deployment. The muster deck smelled of sweat and recycled air, of low-stick smoke and the particular staleness that comes from 10,000 men living in steel corridors. We'd just finished morning prayers, 2 hours of hymns and litanies that left my knees aching and my throat raw, when the administratum clerk arrived. He was a grey thing, wrapped in robes the color of old dishwater, his face so pale and forgettable that I couldn't describe it to you now if my life depended on it. He moved through our ranks like a ghost, consulting a data slate clutched in fingers that never stopped trembling. When he called my name, my actual name, not my rank or regiment designation, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Guardsman," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "Your new posting." He thrust the slate at me as if it burned his hands. I took it, expecting transfer orders, perhaps a promotion, maybe even a commendation. The Emperor knows I'd earned one. Instead, I found coordinates I didn't recognize, redacted behind strings of authentication codes I'd never seen before. Security classification Obsidian, clearance level terminal, departure immediate, no unit designation, no mission brief, no duration of service, just coordinates and a seal that looked wrong somehow, as if whoever had designed it had been trying to ward against something rather than authenticate something. "Where?" I started to ask, but the clerk was already moving away, already calling another name. I looked around at my squad, at men I'd fought beside for years, and found them staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe, or relief that it wasn't them. I never got to say goodbye. Within the hour, I was processed out of my regiment. They took my unit insignia, my campaign medals, everything that marked me as part of something larger than myself. They gave me a standard-issue kit, Lazrafal, flak armor, rations, and a single duffel for personal effects. No ceremony, no blessing from the commissar, just a servitor that guided me through corridors I'd never walked before, down into the transport bays where the real departures happened, the ones they don't announce over the Vox. The transport was a bulk hauler, the kind usually reserved for moving equipment or prisoners. I wasn't the only passenger. There were 11 others, all of them wearing the same lost expression, all of them clutching similar data slates. We didn't speak to each other. Something about the situation, about the way we'd been collected and loaded like cargo, made conversation feel dangerous. The crew avoided us. I noticed it immediately. The deckhands who secured our restraint harnesses wouldn't look at our faces. The officer who conducted the pre-launch inspection stayed as far from our section as physically possible, and when we passed through the ship's small chapel during transit to our berths, I saw one of the crew, a grizzled petty officer with 3 service studs, make the sign of the Aquila and mouth a prayer. Not for the Emperor's protection of us, for protection from us. That's when I understood. Whatever we were being sent to do, wherever we were being sent to go, we were already considered dead, already written off in whatever ledgers the administratum keeps of the Imperium's infinite wars and infinite soldiers. The transport shuddered as it broke from the carrier's docking clamps. Through the small viewport, I caught a last glimpse of the ship I'd called home, of the regiment I'd bled with, growing smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. Then we entered the warp, and the viewport shutters slammed closed with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. In the darkness, restraint harness cutting into my shoulders, I opened the data slate one more time and stared at those redacted coordinates. Somewhere in the galaxy, something was waiting for me. Something important enough to require guards, but not important enough to tell those guards what they were guarding. I closed my eyes and prayed, not for strength or courage or victory. I prayed for ignorance, for the blessing of not understanding what I was about to face. The Emperor, in his wisdom, did not answer that prayer. We arrived at the facility 17 days later, though I can't be certain. Time in the warp does strange things to memory, to the body's natural rhythms. Some of the others claimed it had been 3 weeks. One man insisted it had only been 4 days. We'd stopped arguing about it by the time the transport began its final descent. The moon had no name, not one they told us anyway. Through the viewport during our approach, I saw a dead world, all grey stone and permafrost, cratered and lifeless, orbiting a gas giant whose storms raged in silence across the void. No vegetation, no water, no breathable atmosphere, just ancient rock and ice, and somewhere beneath it, buried like a shameful secret, our destination. The landing pad was a scar cut into the moon's surface, ringed by defense turrets that tracked our descent with mechanical precision. As we disembarked, the cold hit like a physical blow, even through our environment suits. The air, what passed for air, tasted of recycled oxygen and something else, something chemical and bitter that made my teeth ache. A tech priest met us at the airlock, his augmetics clicking and whirring in the thin atmosphere. He spoke in binaric cant to the servitors that unloaded our gear, never once addressing us directly. We followed him into the facility through corridors that descended at a sharp angle, carved through solid rock and reinforced with adamantium plating that bore the marks of immense age. The metal was pitted and scarred, not from battle but from centuries, maybe millennia, of simple existence. The lumens overhead flickered constantly, casting shadows that seemed to move independent of our passage. I'd served in enough ancient facilities to know that flickering lights usually meant failing power systems or corroded wiring. But these lights felt different. They struggled, as if the darkness here was something more than absence of light, something that actively resisted illumination. We descended for what felt like hours, down and down, through checkpoints manned by guards who looked through us rather than at us, past blast doors thick enough to withstand orbital bombardment, through scanner arrays that made my skin crawl with invisible radiation. Finally, we reached the barracks level. It was a depressing place. 40 bunks in a reinforced chamber that smelled of mold and old sweat, lit by those same struggling lumens. The guards already stationed there barely looked up when we entered. They had the appearance of men who'd forgotten how to be surprised, how to care about anything beyond the next shift, the next meal, the next moment of sleep snatched between duties. Our commander, if you could call him that, was a captain whose name I've since forgotten. He conducted our briefing in a monotone that suggested he'd given this speech hundreds of times before, always to fresh meat that wouldn't last long enough for their names to matter. "Your duty is simple," he said, gesturing to a schematic on a cracked data screen. "You will guard Vault Tertius 9. You will maintain watch in 6-hour shifts. You will report any anomalies, no matter how minor, to your shift sergeant. You will not discuss your duty with anyone outside your immediate chain of command. You will not attempt to access the vault's interior. You will not question your orders. Failure to comply with any of these directives is punishable by immediate execution. Are there any questions?" We knew better than to ask. They assigned me to third watch, midnight to dawn, though those terms meant nothing on a moon that never saw the sun. My post was checkpoint Delta -7, a reinforced position 30 meters from the vault's outer door. The checkpoint consisted of a small cubicle with a stool, a Vox unit, a clipboard for logging entries, and a viewport that looked down the corridor toward the vault itself. The first night, if you could call it that, I sat in that cubicle and stared at the vault door. It was massive, easily 6 meters high and half again as wide, constructed of layered adamantium inscribed with prayer seals and purity wards. The kind of door you build when you need to keep something in, not keep something out. The corridor leading to it was empty, silent. The lumens here flickered worse than anywhere else in the facility, creating a strobe effect that made my eyes water. I could hear the facility's systems humming through the walls, ventilation, power conduits, life support, but beneath those familiar sounds, there was something else. Breathing. At first I thought I was imagining it. The mind plays tricks in isolated places, creates patterns from random noise. But as the hours crawled past, I became certain something beyond that door was breathing, slow, rhythmic, patient breaths that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. In, out, in, out. A living rhythm in a place where nothing living should exist. I checked the sensor logs on my data slate. Atmospheric pressure beyond the door, 0. Temperature, minus 170 degrees. Biometric readings, negative. According to every instrument we possessed, the vault contained nothing but vacuum and cold stone, but I could hear it breathing. During shift change, I mentioned it to Guardsman Holt, the man I was relieving. He'd been stationed here for 6 years. His eyes were the eyes of a man who'd seen too much and understood too little, hollowed out by time and terrible knowledge. "Don't listen," he said simply. "The more you listen, the worse it gets." "But what is it?" I asked. "What are we guarding?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't name, pity perhaps, or envy that I still had the capacity to ask questions, to care about answers. "We don't guard it," he whispered, glancing down the corridor toward that massive door. "We keep it company. There's a difference, though you don't know it yet." Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, leaving me alone with the flickering lights and that patient, endless breathing. I sat in that cubicle for the remaining 4 hours of my shift, clipboard forgotten, rifle across my knees, listening to something that couldn't exist, draw breath after breath after breath in the dark. And I understood, with a certainty that felt like ice in my veins, that I would never leave this place. Not really. Even if I somehow survived my posting, even if I was eventually transferred or discharged or killed, some part of me would remain here forever, listening to that breathing in the dark. The Emperor protects, we're taught. The Emperor provides. The Emperor watches over his faithful servants. But in that moment, in that flickering corridor on a nameless moon, I felt no protection, no providence, only the certain knowledge that I'd been sent here to witness something, and that whatever I witnessed would hollow me out, the same way it had hollowed out Holt and all the others. The breathing continued. In, out, in, out. And somewhere in the darkness beyond that door, something that shouldn't exist waited with infinite patience for what came next. Guardsman Kellick broke on the 14th day of my posting, or perhaps he'd been breaking for years and we simply witnessed the final fracture. I didn't know him well. No one did. He kept to himself during off hours, ate his rations in silence, slept facing the wall. He'd been stationed at the facility for 13 years, longer than anyone except Sergeant Vole, and had the look of a man who'd forgotten what the sun looked like, what real food tasted like, what it felt like to be something other than a pair of eyes watching darkness. It happened during morning muster. We'd assembled in the barracks for shift rotation, 43 guards standing at attention while Captain Dravis read the day's assignments from his data slate. His voice droned on in that same monotone, names and checkpoint designations blurring together into meaningless sound. Then he called Kellick's name for checkpoint Delta 7, my usual post, the one closest to the vault. Kellick didn't respond. "Guardsman Kellick," Dravis repeated, looking up from his slate with irritation. "Checkpoint Delta 7, third watch." Kellick stood 3 men down from me in formation. I could see him trembling, his lacerful shaking in his grip, sweat beading on his grey face despite the facility's constant chill. His lips were moving, forming words too quiet to hear. "Guardsman Kellic, acknowledge your assignment." "No," Kellic whispered. Then louder, "No, no, I won't." The barracks went silent. Refusal of orders was unthinkable, suicidal. We all knew the penalty. Captain Drevis's hand moved to his sidearm. "Guardsman, you will—" "The voice!" Kellic screamed, and his rifle clattered to the floor. "The voice in the walls, it won't stop talking. It knows my name, it knows everything, Emperor. Preserve me, it knows." He clawed at his own ears then. Not scratching, but digging, his fingers hooked into claws as he tore at the sides of his head. Blood welled up between his fingers, streaming down his neck, spattering his uniform. The sound he made wasn't quite human, a keening wail that rose and fell like a siren. "It's better to be deaf," he shrieked, gouging deeper. "Silence is better. Silence is mercy. Can't you hear it? Can't you all hear it talking?" 3 guards tackled him before he could do more damage. He fought them with the strength of madness, screaming about voices and whispers and things that knew his name. They pinned him to the floor while he thrashed and wept, still trying to reach his ruined ears, blood pooling beneath his head. "Medicae now!" Drevis barked into his vox, and within minutes they arrived. 2 orderlies in stained white coats, accompanied by a servitor carrying restraints. They injected Kellic with something that made his struggles weaken, then fade. His screams dissolved into whimpers, then silence. They strapped him to a gurney and hauled him away, leaving only blood on the barracks floor and the memory of that terrible sound. "Clean this up," Drevis ordered, gesturing at the blood. "Dismiss to your posts." We scattered quickly, grateful for any excuse to leave that room. No one spoke about what we'd witnessed. No one asked questions. But I saw it in their eyes, the same thought I was thinking. Kellic had been here 13 years. 13 years of watching that vault, listening to that breathing. What had he heard that we hadn't? What would we hear, given enough time? That night, during my shift at Checkpoint Delta 7, I found myself listening more carefully to the breathing beyond the vault door, trying to discern if there was anything else hidden in that rhythm. Words, perhaps, patterns. Messages meant specifically for me. I heard nothing but breath. In, out. In, out. But I understood why Kellic had been listening so intently. Because once you started really listening, once you focused all your attention on that sound that shouldn't exist, it became impossible to hear anything else. It filled your mind, that breathing, until it synchronized with your own heartbeat, your own lungs, until you couldn't tell where the breathing ended and you began. The next morning they found Kellic dead in the Medicae Bay. I wasn't supposed to know about it. They tried to keep it quiet, but word spreads in a facility this small. One of the orderlies told Guardsman Holt, who told someone else, who eventually told me, Kellic had managed to work one hand free of his restraints during the night. The sedatives should have kept him unconscious, but somehow he'd fought through them. He'd torn strips from his blanket, braided them into a crude rope, and hanged himself from the ceiling mount for the IV drip. They found him in the morning, neck broken, face purple, eyes bulging, and on the wall beside his bed, written in his own blood, blood from those ruined ears, he'd left a message, "It knows we're keeping it alive." The commissar arrived within the hour. We'd never seen him before. Most of us hadn't even known the facility had a commissar, but apparently someone had been watching from whatever hole they'd been hiding in. He was an old man, bent and grey, with eyes like chips of ice. He ordered the Medicae Bay sealed, the message scrubbed, and Kellic's name struck from all records. Guardsman Kellic never existed, he announced to the assembled garrison. His posting here never occurred. His death never happened. Any man who speaks of this incident will join him in non-existence. The Emperor protects the faithful, but he has no mercy for those who spread weakness and doubt among his servants. Is this understood? We understood. We always understood. Understanding was easy. It was forgetting that proved difficult. They removed Kellic's body in a sealed container. They scrubbed the Medicaid bay with chemical cleaners that made our eyes water. They painted over the blood-stained wall with fresh white paint that looked too bright, too clean, obscene in its newness. But they couldn't erase the message from our minds, couldn't stop us from thinking about what it meant. IT knows we're keeping IT alive, not it's alive, not we're keeping it contained, but keeping it alive. As if our presence here, our watching, our feeding. I stopped that thought, stopped it hard before it could take root. That night, at checkpoint Delta -7, I tried not to listen to the breathing, tried to focus on anything else, the flicker of the lumens, the hum of the ventilation system, the scratch of my stylus on the log sheet, but the breathing was louder now, or perhaps I was simply more aware of it, more attuned to its rhythm, in, out, patient, endless, waiting, and for just a moment, just one terrible crystalline moment, I thought I heard something else beneath that breathing. Not words exactly, but intention, intelligence, awareness. The thing beyond the vault door knew we were here, knew we were listening, and it was listening back. I spent the rest of my shift staring at that massive adamantium door, at the prayer seals and purity wards inscribed across its surface, and wondered if they were meant to keep something in or to reassure us that we were safe. I suspected the latter. I suspected we were wrong. On the 37th day, they assigned me to sustenance detail. I'd seen the name on the duty roster before, of course. It rotated through the garrison on a weekly basis, always assigned to the newer guards, those who'd been at the facility less than 6 months. I'd assumed it meant kitchen duty, preparing rations for the garrison, managing our supplies, the sort of mundane work that exists even in the Emperor's most secret installations. I was wrong. Guardsman Torrens came to collect me at 0600 hours before morning prayers. He was a thick-set man with burn scars covering half his face, earned on some battlefield I never learned the name of. He'd been at the facility for 8 months, and his eyes had already started to develop that hollow look. "You're on sustenance detail," he said, not quite meeting my gaze. "Come with me." "What about morning prayers?" I asked. "You'll pray later. The feeding schedule doesn't flex. Feeding schedule." The words sent a cold spike through my chest, but I followed him without further question. We descended deeper into the facility, past the barracks level, past the armory and command center, down into sections I hadn't known existed. The air grew colder as we descended, and the lumens flickered worse than ever, casting shadows that seemed to reach for us. We passed through 3 security checkpoints, each manned by guards who looked away as we approached, as if our very presence made them uncomfortable. At the final checkpoint, a tech priest performed some kind of ritual with a handheld scanner, waving it over both of us while chanting in binary cant. Whatever it detected, or failed to detect, satisfied him, and he opened the blast door. The processing chamber lay beyond. It was a large space, perhaps 20 meters across, dominated by stainless steel tables and industrial-grade machinery whose purpose I couldn't immediately determine. Servitors worked in silence, their movements precise and mechanical, their augmetic limbs clicking and whirring. The smell hit me like a fist, chemicals I couldn't name, mixed with something organic and rotten, mixed with incense that failed to mask the underlying stench. On the tables, the servitors were preparing containers, reinforced plasteel cylinders, each about a meter tall, lined up in rows of 3. As I watched, one servitor used a hose to pump thick gray nutrient paste into a container. The paste had the consistency of mortar and smelled worse than corpse starch rations. Another servitor added measured amounts of chemical compounds from labeled drums. Names I didn't recognize, formulae that meant nothing to me. Then I saw what the third servitor was adding. Rats, living rats, dozens of them, squirming and squeaking in a wire cage. The servitor reached in with its mechanical claw, seized 3 of the creatures, and dropped them into the container. They thrashed in the grey paste, their movements frantic, their high-pitched screams audible even over the machinery. The servitor sealed the container with a hydraulic press, cutting off the sound. "Emperor's mercy," I whispered. "There is no mercy here," Torin said quietly. "Only duty. Come on, we load the cart." The servitors had prepared 9 containers, 3 feeding cycles for the week. Torrens and I loaded them onto a reinforced cart, each container weighing perhaps 50 kilos. The cart itself was ancient, its wheels squeaking, its metal frame covered in prayer seals so old the ink had faded to brown. A servitor, this one more machine than man, with only its upper torso remaining organic, connected itself to the cart via cables that plugged directly into sockets in its chest. "Follow," it said in a voice like grinding gears. "Do not speak, do not look directly at the aperture, do not approach within 5 meters of the threshold." We followed it through corridors I'd never seen, deeper still into the facility's heart. The temperature dropped until I could see my breath misting in the air. Frost formed on the walls, on the pipes overhead, crackling beneath our boots. The breathing was louder here, much louder, a rhythmic susurration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We turned a corner, and there it was, Vault Tertius 9. I'd only ever seen it from my checkpoint, down a long corridor, at a safe distance. Up close, it was monstrous. The door dominated the entire corridor end, so massive it seemed to warp perspective, making the space around it feel small and insignificant. The adamantium was black with age, inscribed with wards and seals in languages I didn't recognize. Some of the inscriptions seemed to move in my peripheral vision, writhing like living things. The breathing was overwhelming now. Not just sound, but vibration. I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the soft tissue of my organs. Each breath made the frost on the walls shimmer and crack. The servitor stopped exactly 5 meters from the door. It stood there, cables trailing from its torso to the cart, and waited. For what, I didn't know. Then the door opened, not all the way. Just a crack, perhaps 30 centimeters wide, running vertically up the door's center. The gap appeared without sound, without any visible mechanism, as if the door had simply decided to part. From that gap came a smell that made the processing chamber's stench seem like perfume. Decay, old meat left to rot in a hot sun. But beneath that, something else, something sweet and cloying, like funeral incense, like the flowers they lay on mass graves. And beneath even that, a chemical reek that burned my sinuses and made my eyes water. Through the gap I glimpsed something, movement, something massive and pale, glistening in the darkness beyond the door. It shifted with a wet sliding sound, and for just an instant I saw what might have been flesh, not human flesh, but something else, something that had too many textures, too many colors, surfaces that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at. The servitor pushed the cart forward. It rolled on its squeaking wheels toward that gap, crossing the 5-meter threshold we'd been forbidden to approach. When it reached the door, mechanical arms emerged from the darkness within, arms that were part metal, part something organic, glistening with fluids I didn't want to identify. They seized the containers with surprising gentleness, lifting them one by one into the vault. I heard sounds from within, wet sounds, feeding sounds. The breathing paused, then resumed with a slightly different rhythm, almost satisfied. The mechanical arms returned the empty cart. The door sealed with a sound like a death rattle, metal on metal, grinding and final. The breathing continued unchanged. The servitor turned and headed back the way we'd come, trailing its cables. Torrens grabbed my arm and pulled me along. "Don't think about it," he muttered. "Don't ask questions. Just do your duty and pray you never get assigned to this detail again." But I had questions, so many questions they choked me. Later, back in the barracks, I cornered Sergeant Vole, the oldest guard. the one who'd been here longest. "What is it?" I demanded, keeping my voice low. "What are we feeding?" His face went grey. "You were on sustenance detail. What is it?" I repeated. He looked around, making sure we were alone. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "No one knows. Not really. They tell us it's a Xenos specimen, something valuable, something that can't be allowed to die. But why feed it? Why keep it alive?" "Because," Vol said, and his hands were shaking, "missing a feeding would be catastrophic." Those were the words in the briefing I received 42 years ago. Catastrophic. For reasons above our clearance, we must maintain the feeding schedule, 3 times a week, every week forever. What happens if we miss a feeding? Vol's eyes went distant, haunted. I don't know, and I pray to the Emperor that I never find out. That night, at my post, I listened to the breathing and thought about those containers, about the nutrient paste and the chemicals and the living rats, still squirming when they sealed the lid, about the mechanical arms emerging from darkness, about that wet, sliding sound, about flesh that reflected light wrong. We weren't keeping it imprisoned. We were keeping it fed. We were keeping it alive. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Kellick's final message echoed. It knows we're keeping it alive. The question I couldn't escape, the question that would haunt me through every shift, every meal, every moment of restless sleep. Why would it want us to know that? I lasted 3 more weeks before I broke protocol, not in the dramatic way Kellick had broken. No screaming, no self-mutilation, no public collapse. My breaking was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow erosion of discipline by questions that gnawed at my mind during every waking hour and followed me into my few hours of sleep. What were we guarding? Why were we feeding it? What did it know? The official answer, classified, above your clearance, had stopped being sufficient somewhere around my 4th feeding detail. I'd been assigned to sustenance 3 more times since that first experience, and each time I saw more. The way the mechanical arms moved with an intelligence that seemed beyond mere programming. The way the breathing changed pitch when the containers were delivered, like anticipation, like pleasure. The way frost formed patterns on the walls near the vault that almost looked like writing in some unknown language. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Sergeant Vol had been stationed at the facility for 42 years of watching that door, listening to that breathing, participating in that feeding. If anyone understood what we were truly doing here, it would be him. I found him in his quarters during off-shift hours, a small cell barely larger than a storage closet containing a cot, a footlocker, and a small shrine to the Emperor, decorated with purity seals so old they crumbled at a touch. He looked up when I entered, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this conversation. "Close the door," he said quietly. "Lock it." I did. He reached under his cot and produced a small device I recognized as a Vox Scrambler, illegal for enlisted personnel to possess. He activated it with a click, and suddenly the air felt thick, muffled, as if we were speaking underwater. "They listen," he explained, gesturing vaguely at the walls. "Always. But this gives us a few minutes. Ask your questions quickly." I sat on the floor, my back against the door. "What is it? What's really in that vault?" Vol was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 4 decades of terrible knowledge. "The truth is, nobody knows, not completely. What I'm about to tell you came from my predecessor, who got it from his predecessor, who supposedly got it from someone with actual clearance. It might be truth. It might be a lie we tell ourselves to make the duty bearable, but it's all we have." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped as if in prayer. "It was captured during the Macharian Crusade, or that's what they say. A Xenos specimen, but not any Xenos we had records of. Not Orc, not Eldar, not Tau. Something older, something that shouldn't exist according to Imperial xenobiology. A team of Inquisitors examined it, debated what to do with it, and made a decision. What decision? That it was too valuable to destroy and too dangerous to study openly, that it represented a threat level beyond conventional containment, but also an opportunity they couldn't quantify. So they did what the Imperium always does with things it doesn't understand and can't control. They buried it, put it in a vault on a forgotten moon, assigned guards to watch it, and classified everything at levels so high that even most inquisitors can't access the files. But we're feeding it, I said. We're keeping it alive. Why? Vol's hands were shaking now. That's the part that keeps me awake, the part I've spent 42 years trying to understand. According to the briefing I received when I first arrived, the specimen requires sustenance to maintain stability. Without regular feeding, it would become unstable, and an unstable specimen represents a threat level classified as extinction grade. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. You mean, I said slowly, that if we stop feeding it— I don't know what would happen, Vol interrupted. None of us do. Maybe it would die. Maybe it would break free. Maybe it would do something worse. The Inquisition has declared it essential to imperial contingencies, whatever that means. A living weapon, perhaps, or a prisoner who knows secrets they can't afford to lose. Or maybe— He trailed off, his eyes unfocused, staring at something only he could see. Maybe what? I pressed. Maybe they don't know either. Maybe they're as lost as we are, and the feeding protocol is just insurance, a way to maintain the status quo until someone figures out what to do with it, or until it decides what to do with us. I felt cold, colder than the facility's ambient temperature could account for. Sergeant, do you believe it's contained, truly contained? Vol looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something that made my blood freeze. Not fear, not even despair. Something worse, resignation, acceptance of a terrible truth he'd been living with for longer than I'd been alive. No, he whispered, I've never believed it was contained. Not really. That door is 6 meters of reinforced adamantium, inscribed with wards that took tech priests years to engrave. The walls are meters thick. The vault was built to withstand a direct orbital strike. And yet, I've seen the door bulge. I've watched frost form in patterns that shift when you're not looking directly at them. I've heard the breathing change tempo when certain guards walk past, as if it recognizes individuals. I've felt it watching, not with eyes but with something else, something that doesn't need line of sight to see. He stood abruptly, pacing the tiny space like a caged animal. We're not guarding it, he said, voice rising slightly despite the Vox Scrambler's muffling effect. We're keeping it company. That's what my predecessor told me on his last day here, right before they shipped him off to wherever guards from this facility go when their tour ends. He looked me in the eyes and said, we're not guards, we're witnesses. It wants us here, needs us here, and the day we understand why is the day we're already lost. What happened to him? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He was transferred to a penal legion, sent to fight on the eastern fringe against a Tyranid splinter fleet. According to official records, he died heroically in combat. Vol's laugh was bitter, empty. But I checked, used some favors I'd accumulated over the decades. The legion he was assigned to was wiped out within a week of his arrival. Total casualties, no survivors, no bodies recovered. You think they wanted him dead? I think they wanted him forgotten. Him and everyone else who serves here. We're contaminated, you see, exposed to something that breaks the mind just by proximity. Even if we never see it, never understand it, we're changed by knowing it exists, and the Imperium doesn't tolerate contamination. He sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every day of his 60-plus years. When your tour ends, if it ends, they'll transfer you somewhere distant and dangerous, Somewhere you'll probably die quickly. It's mercy in their way. Better a clean death than carrying this knowledge into old age, spreading doubt and fear wherever you go." I sat in silence, processing his words. Outside, the facility hummed with its usual sounds: ventilation, power conduits, the distant clank of servitors performing maintenance. And beneath it all, always beneath it all, that patient breathing. "Does it—" I hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. "Does it communicate? Is that what Kellic heard?" Vol's face went pale. "I don't know. I've served here for 42 years and I've never heard it speak, but sometimes I dreams of places I've never been, of battles fought before mankind reached the stars, of civilizations that rose and fell while terror was still young. And when I wake, I can't remember the details, but I remember the feeling, the certainty that I was being shown something. Taught what? That we're insignificant, that our Imperium, our Emperor, our entire species, we're children playing with weapons we don't understand, guarding secrets we're not meant to know. And that thing in the vault," he gestured toward the door, toward the distant presence that haunted every corridor. "It's patient. It's been patient for centuries, maybe millennia. It can wait. It will wait. Until we make a mistake, or until it simply decides that waiting is finished." The Vox scrambler beeped twice, indicating its charge was depleting. Our time was almost up. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why not let me believe the comfortable lies?" Vol smiled sadly. "Because you're going to survive your tour here, I can tell. Some men break early like Kellic, some adapt, become hollow, serve their time and get transferred. But some, very few, actually survive, actually leave this place with their minds intact. And those men need to know the truth, need to understand what they witnessed. Why? Because someday, someone will ask you what you guarded on that nameless moon. And when they do, you need to be able to tell them. Nothing that was meant to survive. Everything that cannot be killed. The Imperium's greatest secret and greatest shame." The Vox scrambler died with a final beep. The normal sounds of the facility rushed back in, and with them, the awareness that we'd been speaking treason, that anyone monitoring would have recorded our scrambled conversation, flagged it for review. "Go," Vol said quietly. "Your shift starts in an hour, and remember, we never had this conversation." I left his quarters feeling heavier than when I'd entered, not enlightened but burdened. Because now I understood, the thing in the vault wasn't the only prisoner here, we all were, and unlike it, we had no hope of escape. It happened 43 days into my posting, at 300 hours during third watch. I was at my usual station, checkpoint Delta 7, fighting to stay awake. The monotony of guard duty has a weight to it, a physical pressure that presses down on your eyelids and makes every second stretch into eternity. I'd been staring at the vault door for 5 hours, watching the lumens flicker, listening to that endless breathing when the alarms screamed to life. Red emergency lumens erupted throughout the facility, bathing everything in bloodlight that pulsed in time with the klaxons. My Vox unit crackled with panicked voices overlapping each other, and then a mechanical voice cut through the chaos, the facility's main cogitator cold and emotionless, vault integrity compromised, all personnel to battle stations, containment protocol Sigma in effect. This is not a drill. My training took over. I grabbed my las rifle, chambered a charge pack, and moved to firing position behind the reinforced barricade at my checkpoint. Down the corridor, I could see other guards doing the same, emerging from their posts with weapons raised, taking defensive positions in a perimeter around the vault. The vault door remained closed, sealed, exactly as it had been moments before. But something had changed. The air itself felt different, thicker, harder to breathe, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly increased. My skin crawled with the sensation of invisible insects and when I exhaled, my breath misted in the air despite the facility's heating systems running at full capacity. Frost began forming on the walls, spreading from the vault outward in crystalline patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. The temperature readout on my data slate dropped rapidly. 5 degrees, 10, 15. The metal of my rifle grew so cold it burned my hands through my gloves. "Hold position." Sergeant Voll's voice crackled over the vox. "No one fires unless I give the order. Watch the door." We watched. 43 guards with lasguns aimed at a door that could withstand orbital bombardment, as if our weapons would make any difference if something came through. The breathing had stopped. That's what terrified me most. After weeks of constant rhythmic breathing, the silence was deafening. Wrong. Like the pause between heartbeats, stretched out far too long, the moment before something catastrophic happens. Then the door moved, not opened, moved. The entire 6-meter slab of adamantium bulged outward, metal groaning under impossible pressure, as if something on the other side was pressing against it, not trying to force it open, but simply leaning, testing its strength with casual curiosity. The groaning grew louder. Metal that had stood for centuries creaked and popped, stress fractures appearing in the inscribed wards, prayer seals cracking and peeling away. The bulge grew more pronounced, 30 centimeters, then 40, then half a meter. The door's center bowed outward like a pregnant belly, and I could swear I saw the metal ripple, as if something was moving beneath its surface. "Emperor preserve us," someone whispered over the vox. I sighted down my las rifle at the door's center, knowing it was futile, knowing that if something came through, we were all dead. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the weapon steady. The cold had penetrated deep into my bones now, and my teeth chattered despite my clenched jaw. The door bulged further. I heard rivets popping, the screech of tortured metal, the groan of materials being pushed beyond their designed tolerance. The inscribed wards began to glow, a sickly green phosphorescence that hurt to look at, that made my eyes water and my vision swim. Something was trying to come through, something vast and patient and utterly alien, testing the boundaries of its prison with methodical precision. 17 minutes. That's how long we stood there, weapons raised, fingers on triggers, praying to the God Emperor for strength we didn't possess. 17 minutes of that door bulging outward, of metal screaming, of frost spreading across every surface until the entire corridor looked like the inside of a glacier. 17 minutes of certainty that this was how we would die, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. Our bodies scattered across a nameless moon, our deaths unreported and unremembered. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The pressure ceased. The door settled back into its frame with a grinding sound, the bulge receding until the surface was flat again. The groaning metal fell silent. The glowing wards dimmed and went dark. The frost remained but stopped spreading, and the breathing resumed, in out, in out. Patient and steady and utterly unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. The alarms continued for another 30 seconds, then cut off abruptly. The red emergency lumens faded back to the standard flickering white. The mechanical voice of the cogitator spoke again, containment breach averted. All personnel maintain posts pending inspection. Tech priest en route. We remained at battle stations, weapons still raised, none of us quite believing it was over. Down the corridor, I could see Guardsman Torrens shaking so badly his rifle barrel was describing small circles in the air. Another guard, I didn't know his name, had wet himself, dark stains spreading down his trousers. The tech priest arrived 20 minutes later, accompanied by 2 servitors carrying scanning equipment. He was an ancient creature, more machine than man, his organic parts withered and grey, his augmetics clicking and whirring as he approached the vault. He moved with agonizing slowness, servo arms extending from his back to run sensors over every centimeter of the door's surface. We watched in silence as he worked, the only sounds his binaric mutterings and the soft beeping of his equipment. He spent an hour examining the door, the frame, the surrounding walls. He consulted data screens, performed calculations, chanted prayers to the machine god. Finally, he turned to face us. When he spoke, his voice was a mechanical rasp filtered through a Vox grill embedded in his throat. No breach detected, vault integrity optimal, all seals functional, all wards intact. Atmospheric pressure internal, stable, temperature internal within acceptable parameters. Biometric readings unchanged. Structural analysis no damage detected. Conclusion false alarm. Probable cause sensor malfunction. That wasn't a sensor malfunction, Vol said quietly. We all saw the sensors, the tech priest interrupted, his voice flat and brooking no argument. Experienced a malfunction. The vault was never compromised. Nothing attempted egress. This incident will be logged as a technical failure and reported to the administratum for review. All personnel will return to standard duty rotation. Praise the Omniscire. He departed without waiting for response, his servitors trailing behind him, leaving us standing in that frost-covered corridor with weapons in our hands and the certain knowledge that he was lying. The door had bulged. We'd all seen it. 43 witnesses to the same impossible event. The metal had groaned. The wards had glowed. Something had tested its prison with enough force to warp adamantium. But officially nothing had happened. Captain Drevis's voice crackled over the Vox. All personnel, return to stations. Resume normal duty rotation. Anyone who discusses this incident outside official channels will be subject to immediate disciplinary action. We dispersed slowly, reluctantly, casting glances back at the vault as we returned to our posts. The frost remained on the walls, slowly melting, leaving wet streaks that looked like tears. I spent the rest of my shift at checkpoint Delta -7 staring at that door, listening to that breathing. The door looked unchanged. Same black adamantium, same inscribed wards, same massive hinges. But I couldn't unsee what I'd witnessed. Couldn't unknow what I now understood. The thing in the vault wasn't contained. It was choosing to remain, allowing itself to be imprisoned, fed, observed. And tonight, this morning, it had reminded us of that choice. Had demonstrated with casual ease that the door was only an obstacle if it willed it to be one. It had tested us, not the door but us, our resolve, our faith, our willingness to stand ground against the impossible. And having tested us, having measured our fear and found it sufficient, it had returned to waiting. During shift change, Guardsman Holt relieved me. His face was grey, his hands still trembling from the incident. Before I left, he grabbed my arm and leaned close. "It's playing with us," he whispered. "It could have broken through. We all know it could have, but it didn't. It just wanted us to know that it could, that it's still here because it chooses to be." I had no answer for him. What answer could I give? I returned to the barracks and lay on my cot, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door bulging outward, heard that metal groaning, felt that cold seeping into my bones. And I understood with terrible clarity what Sergeant Vole had meant. We weren't guarding it. We were keeping it company. We were the audience for a performance that had been running for centuries, watching something play out its patient game, witnesses to a slow apocalypse that had already begun and would not end until it chose to end. The breach that wasn't a breach. The test that wasn't a test. The warning. And we had no choice but to remain at our posts, maintain our vigil, and wait for the moment when it decided that waiting was finished. The Emperor protects, they taught us. But the Emperor wasn't here. And whatever was in that vault didn't need his protection. It needed only our fear, our presence, our witness, and we gave it freely because we had nothing else left to give. The message arrived on the 59th day during morning muster. Captain Drever stood before us with a data slate clutched in his hands, his face the color of old parchment. He opened his mouth twice before any words came out, and when they did, his voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. By order of the Holy Ordos of the Emperor's Inquisition, he read, this facility is to undergo complete sterilization within 72 hours. Vault Tertius 9 and its contents are to be terminated via orbital bombardment. All personnel are to be transferred to penal legion stations for memory suppression and immediate expenditure on priority fronts. The barracks erupted, not with shouts or protests, we were too well trained for that, but with the sound of 43 men releasing held breath, with the rustle of uniforms as bodies shifted in shock, with the whisper of prayers to the Emperor begun and abandoned halfway through. Memory suppression, penal legions, expenditure. We all knew what those words meant. They were going to wipe our minds of this place, of what we'd seen, of what we'd guarded. Then they were going to throw us at the nearest war zone, some meat grinder where casualties were measured in millions, and let the odds take care of the rest. Within weeks, maybe days, we'd be dead, and with us would die any memory of this facility, of that vault, of the thing that breathed in the darkness. Evacuation begins at 1800 hours. Drevis continued, his voice steadier now, falling back on military routine because routine was all he had left. Pack only essential personal effects. All weapons and equipment remain facility property. All logs, data slates, and documentation are to be surrendered to the administratum representatives. You have 12 hours. Dismissed. We scattered to our tasks in stunned silence. 12 hours to prepare for erasure. 12 hours before everything we'd endured, the fear, the nightmares, the slow erosion of sanity, would be chemically scrubbed from our brains like graffiti from a wall. I couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it. During my final guard rotation, while the facility descended into controlled chaos around me, servitors packing equipment, tech priests performing last rites over machinery, guards bundling their meager possessions, I made a decision that would have earned me an execution if I'd been caught. I accessed the vault's observation logs. The terminal at checkpoint Delta-7 had limited access, meant only for recording shift reports and anomalies. But Sergeant Vole had shown me, weeks ago during a moment of weakness, how to bypass certain restrictions if you knew the right command strings. Strings that had been passed down from guard to guard, generation to generation, forbidden knowledge accumulated over decades of men who needed to know what they were dying for. My hands shook as I entered the codes. Any moment someone might notice the unauthorized access, might sound an alarm, might send the commissar to put a bolt round through my skull. But I needed to know. Needed to understand why, after centuries of containment, they were suddenly choosing extermination. The logs loaded on my screen in dense columns of data, biometric readings, atmospheric sensors, mass calculations, thermal imaging. Decades of accumulated information, thousands of entries documenting the thing in the vault's every measurable parameter. I filtered for the last 6 months, then I saw it. The specimen was growing, not rapidly, not obviously, but consistently, inexorably, a few kilograms per week. Its mass had increased by nearly 8% since the beginning of the imperial year. The growth pattern was steady, predictable, unstoppable, and it shouldn't have been possible. The feeding protocol provided exactly enough sustenance to maintain metabolic function, nothing more. Every calorie had been calculated, measured, controlled. The specimen shouldn't be growing. It should be stable, unchanging, preserved in its prison like an insect in amber. But it was growing anyway. I dug deeper, pulling up biometric readings, Heart rate, if it had something that could be called a heart, increasing. Thermal output, rising. Electromagnetic emissions, spiking in patterns that the sensors couldn't classify. And strangest of all, its cellular structure showed signs of adaptation, as if it were evolving in real time, reshaping itself at a fundamental level. Then I found the analysis report, filed 3 weeks ago by a visiting inquisitorial tech priest. The language was dense, technical, full of jargon I barely understood. But the conclusion was clear enough. Specimen demonstrates capacity for controlled somatic restructuring despite containment conditions. Current growth trajectory suggests breach probability reaches 87% within 6 standard months. Recommend immediate termination protocols. Specimen has either developed resistance to containment measures or, possibility cannot be dismissed, was never fully contained. Evidence suggests specimen may have been studying captors while under observation. Request immediate review by Ordo Xenos. Classification upgrade to extinction grade entity recommended. 6 months. They'd calculated we had 6 months before it broke free on its own. Before all our watching and feeding and fear became irrelevant. Before it emerged from that vault and did whatever it had been patiently planning for centuries. The Inquisition hadn't changed its mind about the specimen's value. They'd simply realized they were out of time. Better to destroy it now, on their terms, than wait for it to choose its moment. I scrolled further, finding older entries, reports from decades past, from guards long dead or memory wiped, describing incidents like the one we'd experienced. Doors bulging, frost forming in patterns, guards going mad, and through it all, that patient breathing, that sense of vast intelligence waiting behind adamantium walls. One entry caught my eye, dated 43 years ago, around the time Sergeant Vole had first arrived. Guardsman reports hearing vocalizations from vault interior during feeding protocol, claims specimen spoke in High Gothic stating, "I am patient. The door is temporary, your Imperium is temporary, I am eternal." Guardsman subsequently assigned to psychiatric evaluation and memory suppression. Incident classified under Seal Obsidian. No repeat occurrences documented. But there had been repeat occurrences, they just hadn't been documented, or the documentation had been buried, classified, erased. How many guards had heard it speak? How many had carried that knowledge to their graves, either in battle or in the facility's own Medicae bay? The terminal beeped a warning. Someone was running a security sweep, checking for unauthorized access. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they traced the breach to my station. I made a choice. I couldn't stop the bombardment, couldn't save the specimen, not that I wanted to, couldn't even save myself. But I could know, could understand, could carry this knowledge through the memory suppression, even if it only survived as fragments, as dreams, as a nagging certainty that I'd forgotten something important. I downloaded the last 6 months of observation logs onto my personal data slate, buried the files under mundane shift reports, and closed the terminal just as footsteps echoed down the corridor. A tech priest appeared, flanked by 2 armed servitors. He regarded me with eyes that were more lens than organic tissue, and I was certain he knew, certain he'd detected my intrusion, certain I was about to die. "Guardsman," he said in his mechanical rasp, "this checkpoint is being decommissioned. Report to the barracks for evacuation processing." "Yes, sir," I managed, shouldering my rifle and walking past him on legs that barely supported my weight. He didn't stop me, didn't raise an alarm. Maybe he hadn't detected the breach after all. Or maybe, and this thought chilled me more than any other, maybe he didn't care. Maybe the Inquisition had decided that in 72 hours none of it would matter. The facility would be slag, the specimen would be vapor, and we would be empty shells shambling toward our deaths on distant battlefields. What was one guard's forbidden knowledge against that totality of erasure? I spent the remaining hours before evacuation in the barracks, reviewing the stolen data on my slate, while around me men packed their lives into duffel bags and said quiet farewells to the only home some had known for decades. The data painted a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. The thing in the vault had been learning, not just surviving but studying, adapting. Every feeding, every guard rotation, every alarm and incident, it had been gathering information, testing responses, mapping the facility and the humans within it. The growth wasn't random, it was preparation. And now, just as it approached some critical threshold, some point of readiness, the Inquisition was going to turn this moon into a cloud of radioactive dust. Except, I thought about Kellick's message, written in his own blood, IT knows we're keeping IT alive. I thought about Sergeant Voll's words, we're not guarding it, we're keeping it company. I thought about the door that bulged but didn't break, the test that was really a demonstration, the patience of something that had been waiting for centuries. What if the Inquisition was wrong? What if they weren't destroying it before it could escape? What if they were doing exactly what it wanted them to do? The thought lodged in my mind like a splinter, impossible to remove, but I had no way to voice it, no one who would listen, no authority to question orders that came sealed with inquisitorial sigils. At 1800 hours we boarded the transports. 43 guards leaving behind a facility that had been their prison and their purpose. As the transport lifted off, I caught one last glimpse through a viewport of that grey moon, of the blast doors that concealed the facility, of the tomb we'd been guarding. The bombardment fleet was already in position, their weapons charging, their targeting computers locked on coordinates that would soon cease to exist. And somewhere deep beneath that ancient stone, something breathed its patient breaths and waited for fire to fall from the sky. I closed my eyes and clutched my data slate, its stolen secrets warm against my chest, and wondered if I was carrying evidence of humanity's greatest victory or documentation of its most catastrophic mistake. In 72 hours I would know, or I would be dead, or worse, I would be alive but empty, my mind scrubbed clean, wandering some distant battlefield with the vague sense that I'd forgotten something important, something that might have saved us all. The Emperor protects, they say, but sometimes I think the Emperor turns his face away, and we are left alone in the dark with choices we cannot understand and consequences we will never live to see. I volunteered to stay behind. When Captain Drevis called for volunteers to maintain the facility during the final 36 hours while the evacuation proceeded, every rational part of my mind screamed to remain silent, to board the transport with the others, to accept the memory suppression and the penal legion and the quick death on some nameless battlefield. Anything but staying here, alone, watching and waiting while orbital bombardment crews positioned their weapons. But I raised my hand anyway. Drevis stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this, as if every rotation of guards produced one man broken enough, curious enough, stupid enough to volunteer for the last watch. "You'll maintain minimum operations," he said. "Power, life support, observation. When the bombardment fleet gives the 30-minute warning, you'll evacuate via the final transport. Non-negotiable." "Understood. Understood, sir." He handed me a Vox unit keyed to the fleet's command frequency. "Don't be a hero, guardsman. When they call, you run. The Emperor has no need for pointless martyrs, but we both knew I wasn't staying to be a hero. The facility emptied over the next 20 hours. I watched through security monitors as servitors were deactivated and loaded onto transports, as tech priests performed final rites over machinery that would soon be vapor, as the last guards shouldered their rifles and walked away from posts they'd maintained for years, for decades. Sergeant Vole was among the last to leave. He paused at the barracks door, looked directly at the security camera, and mouthed 2 words, "Emperor protect." Then he was gone, and I was alone. The silence was profound. For weeks I'd lived with the constant background noise of humanity, footsteps, conversations, prayers, the clank of equipment, the shuffle of boots on metal floors. Now there was only the hum of power conduits, the whisper of ventilation, and beneath it all, eternal and patient, that breathing. I made my way to the command center, a small room filled with monitors and cogitator banks that showed every corridor, every checkpoint, every sealed door. The screens flickered in the dim light, displaying emptiness, abandoned posts, corridors thick with frost that no one would clear. The facility had become a tomb before the bombardment even began. One screen showed Vault Tertius -9. I sat in the command chair and stared at that massive door. The camera's angle was poor, the image grainy and distorted by the same interference that had plagued every electronic system near the vault. But I could see enough. Could watch that adamantium surface, could see the prayer seals cracked and peeling, could observe the frost patterns that spread across the walls like frozen veins. The breathing was louder now. Or perhaps I was simply more aware of it without the distraction of other sounds. It filled the command center, that patient rhythm, vibrating through the deck plates, through my chair, through my bones. I pulled out my data slate and reviewed the stolen files one more time. The growth patterns, the biometric anomalies, the evidence of intelligence and adaptation. All the proof that what we'd been guarding was never truly contained, never truly under our control. Hours passed. I monitored the bombardment fleet's preparations, listening to terse military communications as they calculated firing solutions and charged their weapons. Lance batteries capable of cracking continents, cyclonic torpedoes that could turn atmospheres to fire. All of it targeted at this one facility, this one vault, this one specimen that the Imperium had decided it could no longer risk keeping alive. Overkill, I thought. Unless they knew, unless they suspected what I'd begun to understand, that this thing couldn't be contained by conventional means, that it had been allowing itself to be imprisoned, that it had been waiting and learning and preparing for something we couldn't imagine. 20 hours into my vigil, the breathing changed. The rhythm remained steady, but the quality shifted, deeper, more resonant, as if it were drawing breath not just into lungs, if it had lungs, but into some vast internal space that had suddenly expanded. I felt it in my chest, in my teeth, in the fluid of my inner ear. The entire facility vibrated with each inhalation. On the monitors I watched frost spread faster across the vault's corridor walls. The temperature sensors dropped precipitously, 40 degrees below zero, 50, 60. The metal of the walls groaned and contracted. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, visible even through the grainy cameras, swirling in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Then, at the 24-hour mark, the vault door opened. Not explosively, not violently, it simply opened. The massive adamantium slab split down its center, each half withdrawing smoothly into the walls as if the locks and seals and wards had simply ceased to exist, as if they had always been suggestions rather than barriers, maintained only by mutual agreement that was now ending. My hand went to the Vox unit, ready to call for immediate evacuation, for early bombardment, for anything. But I didn't press the button, couldn't press it. I was frozen, watching the monitor as something emerged from the vault. It was vast. The camera's perspective made it difficult to judge scale, but it filled the corridor. A mass of flesh that shouldn't exist, that hurt to perceive even through the distortion of electronic transmission. It moved with liquid grace, flowing more than walking, surfaces shifting and rippling as if its form was negotiable, as if it hadn't quite decided what shape it wanted to wear. I caught glimpses of details that my mind refused to assemble into coherence. limbs that bent in too many places, surfaces that were simultaneously wet and dry, organic and mechanical, present and somehow absent. Colors that existed in spectrums my eyes weren't designed to process, that left after images burned into my vision even when I looked away from the screen. And eyes. Emperor, preserve me, the eyes. Not 2, not 10, but hundreds of them, opening and closing across its surface like blinking stars, each one focused and intelligent and aware. They looked at the cameras, looked through them, looked at me. I felt its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my mind, and in that moment I understood everything. We had never been guards, we had been witnesses, required observers for a performance that had been centuries in preparation. Every feeding, every incident, every guard who'd gone mad or died or simply endured, we'd all been part of its education. It had been learning us. Learning humanity, learning the Imperium and its fears and its weaknesses and its blind, stubborn refusal to accept that some things couldn't be controlled or understood or safely ignored. And now, having learned everything it needed, it was leaving, not escaping, not breaking free in desperation or rage. Simply departing. Moving on to whatever came next, whatever purpose had driven it to allow itself to be captured and studied and imprisoned in the first place. The thing moved through the corridors with purpose, flowing toward the facility's exit shafts. I switched cameras, tracking its progress, unable to look away despite every instinct screaming at me to run, to evacuate, to put as much distance between myself and this abomination as physics would allow. It paused at an intersection, and one of its surfaces, I couldn't call it a face, but it served that function, turned toward a camera, toward me, and I heard it speak. Not in High Gothic, not in any language, but I understood it anyway, the meaning bypassing my ears entirely, implanting itself directly into my consciousness. Thank you for your service. You have taught us much. Now we go to teach others. Then it moved on, ascending toward the surface, toward freedom, toward the Imperium that thought it was about to destroy a contained threat. I sat in that command chair, trembling, understanding with crystalline clarity what had happened, what was still happening. The thing had left spores, or seeds, or perhaps simply memories, ideas that burrowed into minds, that changed those who'd been exposed, that would spread like a disease through everyone who'd ever served at this facility. We were carriers now, infected not with a pathogen but with knowledge, with the certainty that something vast and ancient and incomprehensible was loose in the galaxy, wearing whatever faces it chose, spreading through the Imperium like a whispered secret. The bombardment wouldn't stop it, couldn't stop it. It was already gone, already dispersed, already becoming 1,000 things in 1,000 places. The fire from orbit would destroy evidence, would eliminate witnesses who understood too much, would let the Inquisition maintain the comfortable lie that they'd destroyed a threat, contained a problem, protected humanity from Xenos contamination. But they'd really just graduated a student, released something that had finished its lessons and was ready to apply what it had learned. The Vox unit crackled, final evacuation transport departing in 30 minutes. All remaining personnel report to landing pad immediately. Bombardment commences in 60 minutes. I should have run, should have grabbed my gear and sprinted for the surface, for the transport, for whatever remained of my life. Instead, I stayed in that chair and watched the monitors as the thing reached the surface access tunnels, watched as it encountered the final barrier. A blast door 3 meters thick, sealed and locked, designed to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a Titan's weapons. The door opened for it, just opened, as if recognizing a superior authority, as if the machine god itself had decided that this thing had earned passage. It emerged onto the moon's surface just as the first transport lifted off, just as the evacuation entered its final phase. On the exterior cameras, I watched it spread itself across the regolith, becoming thin, becoming diffuse, becoming almost invisible. Then it began to dissipate, breaking apart into particles too small for the cameras to resolve, carried on solar wind and electromagnetic currents, spreading outward into the void, going everywhere, becoming everything. A plague of understanding that would infect the Imperium at every level, teaching lessons that humanity wasn't ready to learn. The Vox crackled again. Final warning, 15 minutes to bombardment, evacuate now. I stood on shaking legs and made my way to the surface. The transport was waiting, engines hot, crew shouting at me to hurry. I climbed aboard, strapped myself into a restraint harness, and felt the ship lift off with a roar that shook my bones. As we ascended, I looked down at the facility one last time, at the grey stone and ancient adamantium, at the tomb that had been a classroom, at the prison that had always been a gift freely given, patiently maintained, carefully ended. The bombardment began 30 seconds later. I watched through the viewport as lance beams tore through stone and metal, as cyclonic torpedoes turned the facility into a lake of molten glass, as the moon's surface cracked and boiled under firepower sufficient to end civilizations. They erased the facility so completely that in minutes there was no evidence it had ever existed, just fresh scars on ancient rock, already cooling, already becoming indistinguishable from the countless other craters that pocked the moon's face. Mission accomplished, threat eliminated, problem solved, except it wasn't, because the thing was already gone, already loose, already adapting and learning and spreading through the Imperium like a whispered prayer to gods that answer only in screams. And I was part of it now, carrier and witness and unwilling prophet. The knowledge lived in me, would survive even the memory suppression they'd promised, would lurk in my dreams and resurface in unguarded moments, would shape my actions in ways I couldn't predict or control. We didn't guard something that was never meant to survive. We guarded something that could never truly die. And now it walks among the stars, wearing the faces of those who once kept watch, spreading through the Imperium, one mind at a time, patient as entropy, inevitable as death, teaching lessons that will take generations to understand, changing humanity in ways both subtle and profound. The Emperor protects, they say. But from what I've seen, from what I know, from what I carry in the hollow spaces where my certainty used to live, I wonder, does the Emperor even know what's coming? Can he see the seeds we've scattered, the infection we've spread, the apocalypse we've midwifed with our diligent watching and faithful feeding? Or is he as blind as we were, staring at doors we thought were locked, guarding things we thought were contained, protecting an Imperium that's already been compromised in ways too fundamental to detect until it's far, far too late? I don't have answers. I have only questions that multiply like cancer cells, spreading through my mind with the same patient inevitability as the thing spreading through the Imperium. They'll wipe my memory soon. Send me to a penal legion. Let me die in some forgotten war on some nameless world. But it won't matter, because the knowledge isn't just in my mind, it's in my cells, in my dreams, in the patterns of thought that will reassert themselves no matter how many chemicals they pump into my brain. I am witness, I am carrier, I am prophet of a truth that will reshape everything. And when I die, when we all die, the thing we guarded will continue, patient, eternal, unstoppable, learning us, becoming us, teaching us lessons we were never meant to survive. The Emperor protects, but sometimes I think not even he can protect us from ourselves, from our curiosity, from our certainty that we can contain the uncontainable, understand the incomprehensible, survive the unsurvivable. We were arrogant, we were blind, we were faithful, and now we are infected, all of us, forever. In his name, Amen.